I am thrilled to be actually moderating this next panel. When we were putting this event together, we really were thinking hard about how to consider art, about how to consider creation and creativity in this conversation. I think a lot of times you have these big, important policy convenings, conferences, and but when you leave out the humanities, you leave out humanity in a real way. And so I thought it was important to invite and bring together three people who have been deep and important inspirations for me in my work and just jam with y'all and talk a little bit about art. So I'm joined by Chief Adjuah, who is which award you want me to list first? The Edison Award. Okay, two-time Edison Award-winning, multiple Grammy nominated musician, composer, producer. What else you got? Yeah, everything. All right, all right. And we have Virginia Hanusik, who is an artist, photographer, and writer whose work explores landscape, culture, and climate change. And we have Clint Smith, who is a writer. And my colleague at the Atlantic. No, Clint has won every award, and I cannot really outline all of them in one page. I want to start I think we gave the panel a somewhat provocative and interesting name, which is the art of catastrophe. And I want to ask each of you, what do you think is the role of art and creation and how we deal with disaster? And I'll start with Clint.
I think excuse me, I kind of alluded to it earlier when I was doing at the beginning of my reading, but part of what I think art attempts to do in the context of natural disaster, in the context of war, in the context of atrocity, is to try to reach for that which we know it cannot grasp, but to try to reach for it anyway. And so, again, to repeat myself, it's in the other part of my life, I'm thinking a lot about public memory. I'm thinking a lot about how nations, how communities, how different spaces remember and account for the atrocities and the wars and the disasters that have happened on its soil. To what extent are they honest about it? To what extent do they sort of run from it? And I think that I am most struck by places that understand that, say, Berlin and the Holocaust. They understand that it is impossible to create a memorial or a monument that captures the enormity, that captures the humanity, that captures the indescribability of what the Holocaust did. And yet, you have to try to build these monuments anyway, even if imperfectly, even if they can never be commensurate to the very thing that happened, which they cannot, because it is the very act of attempting to get as close as you can to the thing that is the most sort of meaningful project of memory more broadly. And so in the context of my own writing, in the context of my poetry, or in the context of my nonfiction, I'm thinking a lot about to what extent, I go back often to Elie Wiesel's Night, and he has a long passage in there where he talks about how impossible it is to use language to describe what he experienced in these concentration camps, in these death camps. And it's a model for me in the way that I think I approach my own work, which is to say that part of what I'm trying to do is use language as much as I can to try to capture with as much humanity, with as much sensitivity, with as much nuance as possible, the dynamics of things that have happened in human history that are actually themselves beyond language, and yet trying to use language to capture the thing that language cannot capture. And as a writer, as an artist, that it is that challenge, it is that that desire to get as close as you can to the thing, again, that you cannot reach, that makes the project what it is.
Virginia, I know I mentioned this earlier, but for all of you who may not have heard, all those photographs that we had on the screens outside, those are yours. They're beautiful, they're striking, in many cases, bracing. And I want to ask you the same question. What do you think is the role of art in how we deal with disaster?
Well, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be here today. And it's been wonderful to listen to all of the previous panelists. I feel very lucky to be in this space, joining you all. I think, as someone who makes work primarily engaged with climate and the environment and thinking about these spaces that we inhabit, how we build on them, interact with them, manipulate them, we're at a point where nothing is untouched by climate and, if you want to say, catastrophe. So I don't think of the role of art as something that is isolated or in a vacuum. We're in this ongoing experience, I think, um, as a humanity right now, where we are in a place where things feel incredibly uncertain, unstable, and a lot of that having to do with just the precariousness of the environment that we live in. So I think a lot with my work, a lot of the photographs that I've been making and the work that I've been doing in Louisiana, a lot of it talks about um, making meaning and finding meaning in these often dark spaces and not knowing what necessarily the future holds for coastal communities, for people that don't necessarily have access to a lot of these protections that are offered for folks inside the levee protection system, thinking about infrastructure, thinking about architecture as kind of symbolic of the ways that we think about the valuation of space. So I think, with a lot of the work that I've been doing in my artistic practice, it's been something of meditative approach, a community and collaborative approach with a lot of the projects that I do, in terms of not just incorporating the visual art and photographs that I work on, but also trying to bring in, as often as I can, folks who work in different mediums and people who don't even necessarily consider themselves artists at all. Because I think that one of the many beautiful things about art is your experience with it and how it changes over time and the subjectivity that you have with it.
Well, I did want to note about your photographs. For me, looking at them, you do see these places that, can be one thing or the other. There's and the inverse of the question about catastrophe, right, is what is art's role in how we it's create and how we think about possibility. And Chief, I want to bring that to you now. What when we think about art and catastrophe, what does art give you? What does art give us?
Well, firstly, I also want to say thank you guys for the moment, to be able to be in community together. So much of what I'm thinking is just really stems from their responses as well. You spoke about meaning making, but for me, I think the main root is courage creation.
Mm.
So much of what we're all seeing in a space like New Orleans after something like that happens is, you know, for lack of a better way of putting it, people, they're walking and their heads are down. They're trying to figure out which way is going to be up. And the artists have a really important role to also service the community in that way, and to lift those heads up and to say that this is going to be all right, and that you're prepared to go through this enduring, and you're capable of coming out on the other side of that better. So for me, so much of our practice is really about courage creation. Obviously, as an artist, when you're going through those moments with the community, if it is your community as well, I think there's I think the nominative reaction to, for most artists is that, oh, they make art as a means of catharsis for themselves. This kind of thing has become some sort of a kind of subjective and internal thing. rather than what I have seen. The focus specifically for so many New Orleanian musical practitioners is to be really, really intentional on honing in on how to figure out how to use the music as a tool for creation of courage. So a lot of our practice is rooted in that. You know?
Well, I want to continue up on that because the question I think that always is there for me is it's kind of hard to articulate, but what is it about New Orleans? That creates that creates creators in this way.
Well, I think it's an environment where so many people are enduring. You have to be courageous. It's also a space that historically is under resourced, so you have to be creative in those ways. You have to figure out how to get from point A to B in an environment where you don't have the tools. You're going to have to develop the attributes that are necessary to be able to do that. I think one of the things that will probably come up today is that we'll probably talk about memory as well. And for me, I think this is also a big part of the practice more often than not when we're asked about that, ancestral recall, ancestral memory, and the larger kind of arc of what the art is doing. More often than not, we don't recognize or shine a light on the fact that the practitioners in this moment and the people in this moment are enduring very similar realities as their grandparents or their great grandparents, right? So if the man in 1990 is going through something similar as the man in 1890, then that sort of corollary in memory that gets left out I think is important to highlight because you are armed with those tools. And I think the musicians tap into the sort of skeleton keys of the expressions allow you to be able to cultivate a musical means of being able to tap in and to access that memory that also fortifies those people. There's some rhythms that I can play that may be a courting rhythm. There's another rhythm that I can play that may be a call to war. So the music has also adjusted and updated and adapted to make sure that those sort of recall priorities that exist in those forms are also highlighted in ways that create that courage.
You clearly you stole my notebook and we're looking at my questions. And I mean, I know we've talked before about lineage, about how what you do honors people who've come before you and incorporates what they've done and what they've taught you. And I want to lob this to Clint. Also, do you see yourself as a creator, as a poet, as a writer, as somebody who is doing all of these different types of creation as part of a lineage that has to do with New Orleans?
I absolutely do. It's interesting because I did not come of age as an artist in New Orleans. As I mentioned before, excuse me, Hurricane Katrina was my senior year of high school. And so my experience of New Orleans is that of a child, as a young person. I've never lived in New Orleans as an adult. And it wasn't until my adulthood, ostensibly, that like my creative practice became more robust and sort of developed into what it is. So in that way, it's almost kind of like all of the ingredients were put into me in the first half of my life in New Orleans, but only manifested themselves as the meal, so to speak, in the second half of my life. And so all of who I am as a writer, all of who I am as a poet, all of who I am as an artist is shaped by the ingredients and the ubiquitousness of art that was a part of my life as a kid. I mean, as my fellow panelists were talking, I was just thinking about how, like, what is it that makes New Orleans different? And there's so many things, but I think part of it, as I look back on my own upbringing there, is that like art really was everywhere, right? There was there's in some places there's like an arts district, or there's like, this is where you go if you want to hear the music or see the paintings or see the artists. But, and there's kind of that in New Orleans to a degree, but like it's everywhere you go. The art is present, right? Artists are everywhere. You go to a Saints game, right? And like there's a second line, there's a brass band, there are painters, they're like, so even, you're trying to go to an NFL game and it's so ingrained um, the Saints are so ingrained in the fabric of New Orleans culture, and as a result, they sort of pull everything else in around them. And I think that uh, I'm really struck looking back by how many spaces there were that I was proximate to, in which there was also art, and in which there were also artists, and that, and I'd be interested to hear you all talk about this. But like this idea of people who are artists also who didn't necessarily like name themselves as such, right? Like I think that's a big thing in New Orleans too, is that like I was around so many people who, like, if you went up to them, they wouldn't be like, I'm an artist or I'm a musician or I'm a this, but the way they lived their lives and the things that they did and the practices they engaged in were very much that of an artist. So it becomes this interesting thing about like how much of the presence of art necessitates art being named as being present versus to what extent is this thing present without it having to be designated as such.
And for all those people who are living, in this creative way, I think it's important to me to understand that it's not just people who work in what we would call the arts either. It's folks who are cooking. It's people who bring this really craft perspective to their work in building buildings and having in managing people. Like it's just a very, I think, specific thing there. Um, I want to ask you though. You talked earlier about how writing is helping you get closer to the thing you can't name, and that you really will never get there. But I also wonder, at least from my own experience, writing about a disaster, a flood that put my own hometown underwater, it helps me better understand it. And I'm curious if your work is it also helping you better understand what happened to you.
Oh, unquestionably. I mean, I think that becomes from the fact that for me, writing is the act of paying attention. Like the thing about the creation of art, the thing about writing as a practice is that it, especially in this era of humanity in which we have supercomputers in our pockets, now there's AI and there is, our attention has never been more fractured. There have never been more ways for us to distract ourselves. There have never been more things for us to do to keep us from thinking about that which is in front of us, or that which was behind us. And for me, I know that like writing is a way of thinking. Like writing a poem, those poems are written. They are the writing of the poem is the thing that makes me pay attention to a moment, a feeling, an idea, a piece of history in ways that I simply think I wouldn't otherwise, right? I think that in my own life, the practice of art making is the thing that constantly sort of regrounds me in and gives me a clearer sense of that which lays before me. And to your more directly to your point, it is that process that helps me to more acutely understand like what I think about something, how I feel about something. I often don't know what I think about a thing until I start writing about it. Right. This is why even before I start, we're colleagues now, but like back in the day, I was like trying to pitch Vann ideas for essays, but the pitches would always be terrible because I didn't know what I thought. Right. So I'd be like, I'd try to write it. He'd be like, write a 200-word pitch, but I didn't know what to say. So for me, I'd be like, I can't write a pitch, but I can write the whole thing, because writing the whole thing is actually what gives me a clearer sense of what I think about the thing. And it's the same for a poem, right? Like I begin the poem, and the thing I love about poetry is that sometimes you can begin the poem with one set of questions and you can end the poem with a whole new set of questions, right? It doesn't even have to necessarily provide you with an answer, but it provides you with a sort of space to meditate upon a set of questions that might open up a whole new set of questions, all of which give you, I think, a clearer sense of your own thinking.
Virginia, your work is, like you said, centered on climate change, and you are located in New Orleans most times now. And I want to ask, did those two things arise together, or are they? Were you thinking about climate change when you came to New Orleans? Or did New Orleans give you the space and frame of mind to think about climate change?
My background is in architecture, so I think through buildings and structure and the ways that, again, we create space and live in space. And in a lot of the previous panels today, this concept of home and housing and the actual physical manifestations of how we create place for ourselves has come up. And I got to New Orleans when I went first in college for a number of volunteer groups that was started by a New Orleanian that went to my college after Katrina. And by the time that I was there in 2011, I was doing more work that was along the lines of like assisting with disaster recovery data with road home funding, working with a neighborhood improvement association in Broadmoor that was led by the now Mayor Latoya Cantrell. Um, so I moved to New Orleans after I graduated from college to work at a nonprofit that was doing coastal restoration work. That was kind of like this bridge and environment and thinking through and working with folks who were doing the state's coastal master plan. So that really allowed me to really get a deep dive and learn about the actual geography and physicality of this landscape. I grew up in upstate New York, which is so different in terms of just the actual topography and thinking about perspective a lot. Louisiana being an extremely flat landscape, you have these expansive views and if you're on the water, being surrounded by this and not necessarily having opportunities just because of the elevation to have a range in perspective to see outside of where you are in that moment where you're standing. Um, so in my work that I was doing along the coastal restoration work, I was making photographs whenever I would go on trips, and I would also just kind of um, go out on my own and take trips with folks that I've met on the water and whatnot to kind of start building this body of work that essentially took like 10 years to make, and something that Clint had just mentioned around not knowing exactly what you're trying to say or what you think yet. I think that way visually, in terms of the photographs that I make, that's not necessarily documentary. Knowing that there's something here that we're looking at and kind of analyzing through the built environment and the form and the ways that architecture of South Louisiana and the infrastructure talks about these stories of place and rebuilding and access and all of those things. So um, I started that work and kind of had been building it over the course of 10 years. And it was a really wonderful exercise as it turned into a book form last year that brought in about 17 people that I've worked with over the course of my time there, ranging from shrimpers to musicians to academics to all of these folks who don't necessarily consider themselves artists, but who are so integral to the actual cultural landscape of the region.
Well, you have all kind of alluded to this and mentioned this in your answers earlier, but you all are involved in so many different, I guess, types of meditation, of arts, of genre and media. And I want to ask each of you, do you, think about when you were, I don't know, rubbing up against the boundary, do you think, oh, I'm going to go do this next thing? Or is it a natural progression for you to trying out new forms, to trying out new genre?
Well, for me, I can say growing up in a space like New Orleans and learning the music from practitioners that had, really specific kind of outlines for what was and what wasn't a certain type of dogma. Um, I could see how those uh, guidelines actually created deficiencies in the expression as a younger person. So if you're being forced to have to speak blues to communicate an idea, what happens if you encroach into a cultural space that doesn't speak blues, right? And so how do you effectively communicate the idea to someone that has a different language, right? And so I think, at least for my practice, it was pretty early on that I realized that as amazing as these improvisers were, as amazing as these artists were, to try and build a template to be able to have a larger message and to reach more people, and I was going to have to sort of personally obliterate all of those lines. And to say that if it exists, then I should also be eligible to engage with it because it will help me communicate those ideas better.
Well, last time we spoke, I would have described you as a trumpeter. And
Oh,
now I'm
yeah.
listening and I'm hearing a whole new set of
Yep.
instruments. What pushed you in that direction?
Well, I guess sort of similar things. What you're speaking to is the last few years. So I started off as a trumpeter. About 15 years ago, I created 7 new types of B flat instruments that were hybridizations of flugelhorns and trumpets and cornets and euphoniums and all of these things. And about 4 years ago, I created an instrument called the bow, which is a double-sided harp that hybridizes 3 different cultures of West African double-sided harps that would have seeded the blues in places like Louisiana and the gullahs and those realities. And all of those instruments are kind of from a foundational space are rooted in the same thing, feeling that the tools that were already there were not going to effectively communicate the idea. Also, I think a big part, at least with the bow, the most recent one was addressing a concern that I had growing up playing music and learning. If you enter into a forum that has a 300-year history of cornet playing with a cornet, there's very specific energies that can be levied to you given those histories. And I've found that for our community specifically, sometimes that can be create paralysis. And so I wanted to try and create musical instruments like the bow that had ancestral recall and memory built into the methodology so that their grandfather's hands were there, but the template is a new 21st century template so no one can superimpose the older idea onto these kids. They can embrace possibility, as you spoke to before, in a completely different way because the template, the sound, what they're looking at, the feel of it may be connected, but is also a completely new thing. So I think, the main priority was to try and contribute something that allowed the next generation to be able to walk in their own kind of shoes, for lack of a better way of putting it, versus having to, in our culture, there's so much that's made about how significant the contributions of the past practitioners like a Louis Armstrong or a Sidney Bechet have been. But part of our contention is that there's a baby right now that has the capacity to be able to build on what Louis Armstrong did. But if every space that he walks into, someone is browbeating him to sound like Louis Armstrong, then he won't be able to realize that potential. You know.
Virginia, I want to ask, I guess, a similar question just about this act of creating across what we used to consider are bright lines around creating art, around photography, around how you incorporate your previous practice and training into what you do. How do you view that? And do you run into any resistance when you are trying to stretch?
I want to maybe say a little bit about my approach, where that came from, being someone who was not raised in the South in Louisiana and seeing so much of the actual visual narrative of a place through the eyes of someone who just saw the news cycle and saw all of these images that to this day are still used to describe the climate crisis in ways that are like stock images, um, that are images of floods and people's houses being destroyed. And I think about like this visual narrative that we've constructed around climate change and the ways that those images are oftentimes the viewer actually has like a dissociative experience through that, because they're seen as these isolated events. They're the consequences of a disaster, when in fact there are so many things. Obviously, disasters don't happen in a vacuum, that went up to why this actually occurred. So thinking about my approach to, rather than photographing and working with the actual destruction caused by storms or floods or these climate events, I have always been much more interested in thinking about the more causal aspects, and thinking about ways that we can visualize these massive policies around flood insurance and disaster relief and all of these things that are invisible policies that show up in the built environment and the ways that people interact with space. So, photography is my main medium, but I also write and I do moving image work. I think that just that fluidity helps me in terms of processing and thinking about the work that I want to make, and feel it out, and not be in this box of only making pictures. And I guess if there's any restrictions or things that I've come up against, it's, I think, just this really deep legacy of photojournalism in this region, in Louisiana and New Orleans in particular, of helicopter journalism, where a lot of times people will come in and take pictures of a place that ultimately is used for like the advantage and propelling their own career in a way. So just thinking about the longer term investment in a place and what that means for me as an artist. It's not necessarily for everyone, but that's kind of something that is important to me.
Clint, I want to ask you now about how you think about yourself as a creator, and what labels uh, you use for yourself.
I generally say writer. I mean, my work spans across poetry, history, creative nonfiction. Um, and what's interesting for me is that sometimes the work begins in one genre and then sort of evolves into another. And so, for example, my first book that I published was Counting Descent, was a book of poetry in 2016. And How the Word is Passed, when I first started sort of thinking about it, it began when I watched the Confederate statues come down in New Orleans in 2017, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, PGT Beauregard. And I was watching these statues come down. I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean to get uh, to school? I had to go down past the statue of Robert E. Lee. To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street today named after someone who owned 150 enslaved people. And so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about how, despite the fact that my grandfather's grandfather was enslaved, and despite the fact that I grew up in a city that was the heart of the domestic slave trade, watching those statues come down helped me understand that I didn't understand the history of slavery in any way that was commensurate to the impact and legacy that it left on this country. And so what I did is what I start doing most times when I am wrestling with my own curiosities or gaps in understanding, is I started writing poems. And I started writing about a bunch of poems about my relationship to the city, my relationship to these statues. And I at first thought that what the book was going to be was a book of poetry about my relationship to these statues and sort of growing up amid this Confederate iconography or slave-holding iconography and street names and building names. And so I was thinking about that, and I was writing those poems. But what happened is that the poems, then I would go to a place and they became these sort of lyric essays. And then these lyric essays started incorporating pieces of historiography. And then I started talking to people, so they included interviews. And then it sort of became this triangulation of like historiography, conversations, and like going to places. And so what began as a poem ultimately sort of morphed and evolved into this bigger thing, because that's what the project was telling me to do. And sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes I start doing like sort of reported work, and the conversations that I have in my reporting inform me that the question I'm asking actually demands to be answered in a different form, maybe in the form of a poem, than in a reported essay. And so I kind of move. I follow. What I hope is in the tradition of many Black thinkers and artists who created work who didn't focus in a specific genre and say I am a novelist or I am a essayist or I am a poet or I am a playwright. Or what they did oftentimes was let the nature of the question shape the direction of and the form and the medium and the genre that it would that the project would take.
Do you consider yourself a reporter now?
This is an ongoing thing between me and because I came in journalism sideways. Even in me using the language of reporting versus research, Vann's eyes are lighting up like, because
Oh,
5
I'm
years
going
ago,
back. I'm telling
No,
everybody now.
I wouldn't
Clint
know.
is a reporter.
I wouldn't have said that long ago. But I think, I mean, to be real, I think that's part of it is because I had a limited conception of like what journalism was and what reporting was, and I associated it with something that was not artful, right? I was coming from a space where I was like, I'm an artist, I'm around artists, I write poems, and now I'm trying to transform that artistry into prose. And the idea of reporting, into my mind, which I now realize was overly reductive of me, was something that was at odds with craft. And what we know about the best sort of journalism is that it often is one that incorporates a profound amount of artistry and brings it together with research and reporting and history to create something that hopefully is really dynamic. And so now, because I have a broader conception of what the possibilities of journalism and nonfiction can be and what they can look like, I am happy to say that I go and report just like my Vann would want me to.
Sounds like bloodlines.
Yeah, exactly.
He still didn't call himself a reporter. You notice. Well, within that lineage, though, we're talking about people who we've learned from, who are inspirations to us, especially in that Black tradition of it's Baldwin going out and doing reported essays and also writing plays. It's Lorraine Hansberry doing the same. It's so many people who, like you said, are letting the question shape their work and who also are not having to, or by necessity, are not able to rely on the same sort of standards of expertise and the strict bright lines. And I want to know from you, why do you think that is? Why do you think that's particular in this Black tradition?
Well, I was going to ask you to flip it. Why do you think?
Oh wow, he is a reporter.
Cause no, but like this is something we've talked about before, and it's really interesting to me. Like so many of the Black writers and creatives that we look back, like in the Harlem Renaissance, like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin, like so many of these cats, they were reporters, right? Like they literally were like Langston Hughes was like literally a war reporter. Zora Neale Hurston, like what she was doing obviously was anthropology, but also was reporting, and with Baldwin so much. But it's interesting to me that we don't, and this might have been my own hang up, because I think of myself, I want to think of myself in that tradition, but we never name those folks and call them like journalists or reporters. Like we talk about Langston as a poet, we talk about Zora as a novelist, we talk about Baldwin as even essayist in a way that feels distinct from reporter or reporting, even though that is what like the fire this next time I mean, that's what it is, right? Like he's going and it's reportage. And I'm wondering, for you think so deeply about these questions, I'm wondering why you think it is that these figures, both in the Black artistic tradition, but also across the history of certainly American writing, more broadly, like so many of the greatest novelists were also war reporters in World War II, World War I. Like, why is it that part of that is not as central to their sort of like public or historical narrative as the other genres that they participated in?
I mean, I think that last part is exactly what you mentioned earlier about yourself. I don't think a lot of people view reporting as craft. You know, they see it as an accessory to the thing. But in the Black tradition, the projects of Jim Crow and slavery, part of them, to me, the goal was oblivion. The goal was to not just make you forget and make the people around you forget, but to make you believe it was always this way and it will always be this way. And in order to do that, you have to control the facts. You have to tell people they don't have a history, they don't have a story beyond what you're telling them. And so I think if you're going to write against it, if you're going to create against that, you kind of have to compile the facts on the ground first. Because people, the whole thing would be like, if you don't have this reporting, this body of knowledge, people will dismiss it. And if you're somebody trying to do the work of penetrating that, I think, reporting is a natural part of your process. At least that's how I think about it. But that's enough for me. Now, um, I you brought me to the next thing that I really wanted to get into, which was memory. You know, I do think catastrophe, the most perfect catastrophe or the worst catastrophe would be one where nobody remembers it, where it does the job of erasing a story and a memory. And I want to hear, Chief, from you, is your creation, is your ancestral recall, is that a at least partially a reaction against disaster or safeguard against it?
Well, I think it's important that we're really clear about the fact that it seems pretty easy to wipe things away from public memory, to wipe persons away, you know, and you know, a lot of the work that we are building is about fostering connection, and in order to do that, we have to have a very clear depiction of what happened before. To me, right? I think the murkier those waters are, the more difficult it is to achieve that. You know, but in terms of process, um, you know, these disasters and catastrophes happen in realities where you know, it may not be a storm, but it's still a disaster,
Right.
right? So, you know, I grew up in the Ninth Ward of New Orleans. Um, you know, in the black tribes and the nations there, which are, you know, designed to make sure that the people have safe spaces to be able to express, to be able, you know, we talked about all of the artists that don't label themselves as that. You know, I can think of the bead workers and the musicians that wouldn't label themselves that were around in those spaces. And, you know, those communal expressions are born out of a reality where people are under resourced, and like you're saying, are still enduring a reality where they're surrounded by potential erasures and this notion of a larger oblivion, right, to obliterate that culture. And so you know, I think it's for my practice, you know, I released a record called Anthem that happened right after the storm, and so there have been some specific moments that relate directly to a disaster or not. But I would say the entire practice is about giving warnings, creating courage, but related to the fact that those, what we're labeling catastrophe and disaster, is actually a constant for some communities, right?
Well, I was going to ask about if the catastrophe of slavery,
Yeah,
sort of animates everything, right?
for sure. Well, I mean, I think you know, I can't speak for other realities. I can speak for what I've seen in New Orleans. You know, um, it doesn't seem to me that the environment is concerned with mending any of those things. It is still preoccupied with erasure. It is still preoccupied with superimposing pejorative and belittling ideas about certain groups that are rooted in those sort of antebellum kind of energies and ideas. So, you know, when people speak to what's going on in the city now, and you see the musical expressions that don't acknowledge any of those energies. That's always curious to me. And it's not to say that other artists should make sure that their work is dominated by those narratives and work to subvert those things. But it does seem to be deficient and missing a lot when you actually ignore the reality that the people that your art is serving, the reality that those people are enduring, right? Um, yeah, that's I guess I hadn't really put it into those terms, because it's those that reality hasn't shifted, right? And I don't mean to stop you, but when we talk about the enslavement period, we deal with that as if it ended. It did not. It just the means by which that could be your life reality shifted, right? So we know if you're duly convicted of a crime in the United States, that can befall you, right? But I just want to add this point to that. When I made the corollary between the memory of the man in 1990 and the man in 1890 or 1790. Like, sure, the guy in 1790 was enduring a very specific type of slavery where he had to wake up every day and invest time in what the other man's vision and want was, and endure all of those horrible things in that lifetime, every moment of that lifetime in service to that, with the threat of overt violence as sort of this anchoring thing. But in this moment, I look around my neighborhood in the Ninth Ward and I see people that get up every day and work 2 jobs, 3, 4 jobs. They don't have many of the resources and things that they need, and their life reality is essentially still that. It may not be linearly the threat of overt violence in the same way, so much as it is the threat of starvation, right? So to me, yeah, obviously the environment has shifted in some ways. It's like, yes, you're more technologically advanced and you have all of these other resources that from the outside perspective looks like you have progressed. But in terms of the man that has to get up every day and go to 4 jobs to essentially endure wage slavery, you have not. So I to me, it feels deficient when we ignore those realities.
One thing that always drew me to New Orleans was the fact that those stories they were always just written on the wall in a lot of places. It literally on the wall in a lot of places. History just had a way of accreting over and over. People would build in the same place. A lot of people would live where their grandparents and great grandparents lived. But I think a lot of people in the city now will say that is changing a bit. That there are people who are, there's now more new development. There's a lot of things being paved over. Uh, Virginia, from your perspective, as somebody who is observing and keen on observing space, have you seen that aspect of the city change at all in the past few years?
Well, I can only speak to my experience there. I think that, you saying paving just explicitly made me think of these conversations that we've been having around facade and exterior and home and structures and the amount of investment that went into preparing for the Super Bowl and thinking about, roads being like all of this maintenance and construction and infrastructure investment um, for essentially, a tourism like, capital plug when there's so many roads, as throughout New Orleans, where my car has been broken many times and street flooding. So I just you saying paving and thinking about like this infrastructure and the resources happen to be there for the sake of actually like um, uh, making this space inhabitable for like outsiders to come and having that on the national stage. But before I lose my train of thought, I think that a lot of my work being outside of the levee system and kind of thinking about the ways that storms and weather are markers of time in a way, in terms of thinking about how um, a house next to a slab on grade house, so you have just kind of the concrete slab on the ground, house on that, next to a house that's raised 12 feet, next to a house that's raised 20 feet. Those kind of visual, that dynamic and kind of just a visual representation of architecture, you start asking these questions of why and how, and thinking about the lack of a comprehensive climate adaptation plan that we have, not just in South Louisiana, but for the rest of the country in terms of when Orleans Parish floods, places like Irish Bayou and Venetian Isles, all these places outside of the levee district, St. Bernard Parish, Plaquemines Parish, you know, you see kind of the ways that people have either been able to elevate their houses through federal assistance or through actual private wealth. So it's just endlessly something that I'm endlessly curious about in terms of thinking about the ways that you're looking at how people are kind of maintaining their ownership of space and these generational ties to space, and challenging what's often still heard in the kind of this conversation and rhetoric around after storms of why do people live in these spaces and why don't they move. And we've spoken multiple times today about the ties to land and the generational ties to that space, and also just moving and all of these things take an enormous amount of money if you even want to. Um, so I'm rambling, but
No,
those
it's all
are
good.
those are some ways.
You mentioned Plaquemines Parish, and a big portion of my upcoming project is in Plaquemines Parish, and because I think you go there and cause and effect our next door neighbors, right? I was interviewing a guy, one of the Satsuma orange growers, who was complaining about the growing season changing, and literally had to like stop the tape because an oil derrick was making noise behind him. It was like, well, there's your thing.
And you
Yeah,
also have the river diversion project,
right.
which was this massive project to divert the river and generate land regeneration, or create new lands in Plaquemines Parish, directly next to the largest liquefied natural gas export terminal being created in North America. So Plaquemines is, and also just kind of the lack of resources and funding in terms of rebuilding after storms, after Ida, especially.
Yeah, Ida was a tough one. Um, I want to ask each of you what I think of at least my own work now in terms of my children, in terms of something that I leave to them and am creating with the intent of leaving to them. And when I ask each of you, do you view your work as instructive, or is it or yeah? Do you view your work as instructive?
I certainly do.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I was raised in a space where when you learn to, even I spoke about the dogma of learning the music and that context, but one of the beautiful things there is you see the utility in generational information,
Mhm.
right? You can literally track, oh, this guy is 90 years old and he played with Louis Armstrong and Kid Ory, and he has a certain amount of information. And the person in their 60s was able to take that information and to put it in this context. And so, and maybe, the 90-year-old in terms of playing at that time may have diminished returns. He may not be able to just grab the cornet and play the thing that he could play when he was 40. So developing the ability to not just artistically leave the contribution, but to use all of the tools at your disposal to make sure that you're disseminating that information to the next group is pivotal. So I would say yes.
Virginia.
I think to some extent it is instructive, more so as a filter or guide for thinking about issues rather than having a hard stance through my own narrative on what is right or what you should be thinking and what you shouldn't be thinking about the work. Um, Working with visual art, there's a lot of opportunity to sit with the work for a longer period of time, to put it into different formats, a book format, exhibition format, lots of different collaborative approaches to bringing it into a public forum. So I think a lot of my work is speculative, and I have had many opportunities over the course of my career where I really appreciate insight and feedback and questions and this dialogue with people who have either read my work or have seen it, and thinking about it as kind of like this endlessly um, it's an endless conversation between who's making the work and who is kind of experiencing it. And also in book format, like I think that it's something that's so special and specific because you can come back to it at another point in time, and that can be completely different to you how you experience it then.
Clint.
Yeah, I guess instructive doesn't necessarily mean didactic. And so I certainly don't want my work to feel didactic. I never want somebody to feel like they're being bludgeoned with me telling them like when I didn't want How the Word is Passed to be like, here are the 10 things you should have always known about slavery, right? Like, because that would be disingenuous to the project. That would be disingenuous to me because the project was born from a space of trying to fill in the gaps of my own education, right? So for me to write it in a way that, as if I were trying to instruct or tell or convey information that I had always held, like I came out the womb reading Baldwin. I think that
You
would have
did, though.
been like, my mom would like to tell that story. That's not that's not the truth. But what is true is that every project that I work on is first instructive for myself, right? Like I'm very clear that like if I'm writing, if I'm working on a book specifically, I pick book subjects that are attempts to sort of chase my own curiosities, and that makes it so that the project of creation and of reporting and of craft making is intellectually and creatively generative, regardless of what happens externally with the product. And the same for a poem, right? The poem is instructive for me because, as we've talked about, it is a means of me paying closer attention to the world. It is a means of helping me more fully understand what I think about something. So it is instructive, but I think my work is instructive I am my first audience. I'm my primary audience, and I hope that the efforts toward personal instruction can be helpful or meaningful or generative for others as well. But I don't begin with an externally instructive set of desires, or having that be the sort of metric or central propelling feature of my work. Instead, it's what am I curious about? What do I want to understand more about? In what ways can I challenge myself or my own set of ideas and preconceived notions? And that is what ultimately makes the work feel meaningful.
Now, I do want to open up the floor for questions in just one moment, but I have a quick question for you, Chief, and that is, what do you say when people call you a jazz artist?
Wow. Yeah, I've hated that since I was a very small kid. Well, mainly because, even as a small child, like I said, I was really curious as to the fuller history of it. And, jazz is a really belittling and pejorative and sensationally racist term. This is a term that has its birth in it being a shortening of jackass. It was called jackass music, JASS. The first record that exists in this culture of music was made by European descent Americans pantomiming and satirically pantomiming the contributions of the African descent New Orleanians. And that record is called the Original Dixieland Jazz, JASS Band, right? And so for me, when I would see teachers like Kid Jordan or Clyde Kerr or Alvin Baptiste and these beyond regal and really intelligent men, I didn't see a jackass. I saw practitioners that had a code and that made sure that they were important and a really, really beautiful legacy to the next generation. So we don't use that term. We prefer to say stretch music. The 21st century sort of group of practitioners uses this term in many instances instead of jazz, just because it's just anytime I see it, I kind of cringe. I have sort of gone on a campaign for the last 20 years of my career since kind of popping up as a teenager, really wanting to understand why, there's a jazz festival in every city. I can go to Jakarta, I can go to Melbourne, and there's a jazz festival. And so it was always curious to me why so many people were preoccupied with projecting that term after Miles Davis and Charles Mingus and all of these great practitioners over many decades, almost a century, said, don't identify me with that. That is essentially a racial epithet. And not only does it inaccurately describe what's going on, it is also something that is used as a means of diminishing and belittling and throwing all of those beautiful contributions into a vat of trash. So it rubs me the wrong way. But I also say, listen, my name used to be Christian Scott. Right now, I'm Chief Xian aTunde Adjuah. For some reason, my life has sort of been marred by a non-acceptance of certain labels. And just as it relates to the larger histories, yeah, I'm a 7-year-old little boy looking up the history of jazz and finding the Times picayune articles that deal with it being jackass music. I'm also a person that was at 7 years old reading and wanting to understand how a group that had the history that our group had would have those kinds of names. And for me, similar to jazz, at a certain point, I felt it was important to levy my non-acceptance and to also to try and create alternatives to those things. To me, I do feel in my heart also one of the last components of full self-emancipation in this space is also the walking away from those surnames and those stamps that essentially still project us as captured beings. And jazz is a part of that.
All right, now I want to open it up for questions.
Thank you all. I'm Natasha Varner. I'm a historian and ESSET 250 fellow with New America. Y'all have given me a lot to think about, so thank you. One thing on my mind is just how our society values art as essential, but artists as expendable. And so in thinking about the art and catastrophe and thinking back to earlier conversations about resilience, have you all seen anything emerge in the aftermath of Katrina or just in general in like living in the ongoing disaster of climate change and life in capitalism that has pointed to building resiliency for artists? Or even if it was fleeting after Katrina, I'm just curious if you've seen any models that seemed valuable.
Well, I'll just say, at least from the sort of inter-New Orleanian kind of cultural spaces, it's a group that already had to be resilient. So, the catastrophes that we're speaking about, the storms that we're speaking about, they create a moment where, there seems to be more of a focal point on that because that the community is enduring something because there's been this massive mark. But I will say that that corridor of creators is always has to maintain a certain type of resiliency because of what the environment gives.
Piggybacking on your question, I've been thinking about what the loss of so much funding and grant funding for artists in particular, means, especially for artists of color, especially in communities that will lose programs from like the ground up. And so I know this is outside the scope of your practice, but can you speak a little bit to what might fill those gaps, or how we as a society think about filling those gaps that are going to be so acutely felt?
I mean, Chief might be able to speak more to this, but like I am um, always thinking about the ways in which sort of in New Orleans specifically, music for a lot of, and I'm thinking about this specifically through the prism of young men, for a lot of young men in particular, and also young women, because it's important to note, but I know in my own family and in people that I've been mentors to and communities that I'm proximate to, um, there's a large sort of sociological body of work that talks about like sports and other extracurriculars as a means of like preventing young boys from getting involved in crime or getting in trouble or like having nothing to do and sitting around. And in New Orleans, like there's so many young people for whom music is that thing, right? There's so many kids who like pick up a trumpet, pick up a trombone, pick up a drum set, and that gives them art. It gives them proximity to community. It gives them a thing to 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 imagine themselves as like improving upon. It gives them it. It is the thing that I think that sports plays for so many. It's like, oh, I'm part of a team. I'm part of a thing that I can get better at. I'm part of, and it prevents a sort of uh, listlessness or restlessness, or sort of it gives a young person something to do. And so many of the programs in New Orleans that I think provide a lot of after school music engagement, that provide instruments to young people. Those are the sort of organizations, not only because of federal funding, but what like part of the sort of conversations that I've been hearing during lunch and during breaks is like, it's not just federal funding that's being pulled back. It's like funding more broadly, right? So the federal funding is obviously particularly insidious in its manifestations, but like funders are pulling back from all sorts of things all over the country. And I think to a point that was made before, the arts are one of the first things that people can pull back from. It's one of the things that feel most expendable. And so I do feel concerned that as these programs lose their funding, as programs that recognize that music can play an important role in keeping a young person out of trouble, but also helping a young person like more fully self-actualize, that there's going to be an even greater gap than there is now of young people feeling like they don't have an anchor. And I know that in New Orleans in particular, around the country, but in New Orleans in particular, the role that music plays in a young person's upbringing and how a young person conceives of their sense of self is particularly strong. And I worry about our city when it loses that.
I will jump in if that's okay, because you know the kid you're talking about was me, right? You know, I grew up in the neighborhood, went to a lot of different schools. I was a straight A student, but I was always fighting. So I had to go from one school to the next school. My mother would pull us out. I have an identical twin brother as well, and you know, I wanted to be a prize fighter until I found a B flat trumpet, right? And it completely changed my reality, having that community to lead on. But what I will say, just in terms of the divestment, you know, because in the linear fashion, in spaces like New Orleans, that's not where you learn to do that, right? So it's like, yes, they may be a jazz camp here, a jazz camp there, and obviously that's always going to be unfortunate when we divest in terms of the things that are going to build beautiful futures. But one of the beautiful things about what that community has had to do, because depending on which regime is in, you know, all of those things, you know, some communities don't have the ability to escape from or rise above fascism. Some communities have to deal with it no matter who is in. And so I think our community has been developed very specific tools to make sure that no matter what's going on in the larger equation, that those skill sets and those tools are imparted to the next generation. Yeah.
We have one more quick question right here.
I'm a native of New Orleans, so I got a quick comment about the Super Bowl. I used to work for the NFL, and I went to many Super Bowls. I went to an after party when the Saints won, and I was walking around, and there was James Carville, Kim Kardashian, who was dating Reggie Bush at the time, and the Archbishop and 2 nuns. Never seen that at any after party at any other Super Bowl.
This sounds like an
That's the
intro to a
crowd
joke.
at a Super Bowl. But I have a serious question. So, as a native, I think gentrification is too easy of a term to talk about what's happening to the city. But if the forces that resist gentrification, or whatever you're going to call it, lose, and New Orleans, becomes Dallas, throw the whole country away. Just like literally throw America away. It has lost one of its centers of soul. Maybe a simplistic question, but what is happening to the artistic community at the grassroots level post Katrina?
I'm sorry to anybody here from Dallas.
Well, yeah, it's different, That's a hard one because, I'm not a person that, we understand that the larger history here is riddled with, this kind of movement, right? One group in an area, another group moves. Some folks don't want to be around each other for a time because the normative way of interacting is to be hateful towards each other, these kinds of things. And, it's kind of, it's a dual thing for me, right? Because I'm a chieftain of one of the tribes in Louisiana. I'm the Grand Griot of New Orleans. So preserving culture and making sure that those erasures don't happen is part of what I'm mandated as in terms of my sort of, for lack of a better way of putting it, kind of social roles in those spaces. But as an artist who recognizes the beauty in the broader human family, I think those folks that are incoming that have created the New Orleans also have ways of contributing things that would not be contributed if they weren't there. So, I'm sitting next to a person that represents that cadre, right? So I think it's a twofold. Years ago, right after the storm, I came back into town to do a fundraiser, and I was like warming up my horn in the 7th Ward, and this brand new club owner from another area was like, "Hey, you can't play a trumpet in this neighborhood this late." It was like 10 p.m., right? And I'm like, homeboy, Freddie Kepper's house was right over there. This is where this comes from, this kind of thing. And obviously, eventually, he learned that. But I think part of what really needs to happen is to make sure that those groups, when they're encroaching, also have a moment where they're oriented into the space that they're coming into. I think more often than not, we have a tendency to self-segregate, and then as a byproduct of that self-segregation, we're not sharing stories and ideas and finding the points of connection and synergies between each other. And that's the part that creates calamity. My life's experiences as a world citizen and someone that's really been touring since almost 11 or 12 years old is that all of the things that I'm seeing people endure and go through in New Orleans, I could go to Latvia and it's the same issues. That area may be ethnically homogenous, and so some issues are different. But the point that I'm making is they also may have a moment or a neighborhood where a new group is encroached in, and now there's kind of angst and negative speech and energies towards that group, rather than trying to figure out what it is that group can actually contribute or invest in through meaningful communion with each other. So there's an odd duality there. As a cultural practitioner and someone that is responsible for those things, you want to do your best to try and maintain and fight the erasure. But that is impossible in a reality that shifts as much as this one does. And I learned as a little boy, the only thing that you can bank on is that something will change. And I think being adaptable and willing to embrace that change to draw certain lines in the sand about there being a code and a way of conduct and history in these spaces, but it requires a more comprehensively built system and model for how we interact with each other versus just labeling this, you're an outsider, you're new here, and therefore don't belong, you know?
Well, thank you. And thank you. I think that's all the time we have.